23rd of November, 1940. The night air over southern England hangs heavy with moisture, the cloud base at 700 meters obscuring the moon. At 2200 hours, a lone Heinkel He 111 crosses the English coast near Dover, flying at 4,000 meters on a heading of 290 degrees. The aircraft's navigation lights are dark. Inside the cramped fuselage, the crew maintains radio silence. They are bound for London, carrying 14 500-kilogram high-explosive bombs and an equal number of incendiaries. The pilot checks his watch, calculates his ground speed against the headwind, adjusts his course by 3 degrees. In 42 minutes, if the navigation is precise, they will be over their target. Below them, in the darkness, Britain waits. The bomber crosses the Kent countryside, a mechanical intruder in the night sky, invisible to the naked eye, its engines a distant drone that blends with the wind. Nobody on the ground hears it pass. Nobody sees the shadow against the clouds. And critically, at this moment, nobody knows it is there. The aircraft continues westward, penetrating deeper into British airspace. The crew maintains their course, unaware that their position, altitude, and heading are being tracked with remarkable precision by a technology they cannot see, cannot jam, and scarcely understand. 23 kilometers to the south, at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, a tall steel mast rises 90 meters into the night sky. Attached to this tower are arrays of dipole aerials, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Every few seconds, a transmitter at the base of the tower sends a powerful pulse of electromagnetic energy into the darkness, a pulse lasting only 2 millionths of a second, but containing 20 kilowatts of power. These pulses, operating at a wavelength of 13.5 meters, propagate outward at the speed of light. Some of this energy scatters uselessly into space, but a tiny fraction strikes the aluminium skin of the Heinkel, reflects back toward the transmitter, and is captured by sensitive receiving aerials mounted on a separate tower 180 meters away. The time delay between transmission and reception reveals the aircraft's range with extraordinary accuracy. The bearing is determined by the directional characteristics of the aerial array. The altitude is calculated through geometric triangulation, using the angle of the returning signal. This is Chain Home, Britain's revolutionary early warning system, and on this November night, it provides Fighter Command with something unprecedented in the history of warfare. 10 minutes advance warning of the bomber's approach. 10 minutes does not sound like much. In the scale of human experience, 10 minutes is a coffee break, a brief telephone conversation, a handful of pages in a novel. But in the calculus of air defense in 1940, 10 minutes represented the difference between chaos and order, between reactive desperation and coordinated response. Consider the mathematics. A Hawker Hurricane or Supermarine Spitfire requires approximately 3 minutes from scramble order to become airborne, assuming the pilot is already in the cockpit or within sprinting distance of his aircraft. The climb to operational altitude of 6,000 meters demands a further 6 to 7 minutes, depending on atmospheric conditions and the degree to which the pilot is willing to stress his engine. This totals 9 to 10 minutes from alert to intercept position. Without early warning, fighters scrambled after hostile aircraft were detected visually or by sound detectors would still be climbing when enemy bombers reached their targets and turned for home. The defenders would arrive not to prevent the attack, but to survey the damage. With 10 minutes warning, the equation changed entirely. Fighters could be airborne before the raiders crossed the coast, climbing to altitude whilst the enemy was still over the channel, positioned to intercept with height advantage and the initiative firmly in British hands. This temporal margin, this slender buffer of 600 seconds, transformed the nature of Britain's air defense from a forlorn hope into a viable system of protection. The technology that provided this advantage emerged from a question posed in January 1935. The Air Ministry, increasingly alarmed by the expanding Luftwaffe and the vulnerability of British cities to aerial bombardment, had established a committee under Henry Tizard to investigate possible means of air defense. At the committee's second meeting, physicist Robert Watson Watt was asked whether a death ray, using radio waves to damage aircraft, was feasible. Watson Watt, superintendent of the radio research station at Slough, had been conducting experiments on radio wave propagation for meteorological purposes. He calculated that destroying an aircraft with radio frequency energy would require approximately 100 million watts of power focused on the target for several minutes, a requirement so preposterous as to be dismissed immediately. But in preparing his negative response, Watson Watt recognized a different possibility. If radio waves could not destroy aircraft, perhaps they could detect them. The physics was straightforward, almost embarrassingly simple. Radio waves propagate through space at the speed of light. When they encounter an electrically conductive object, some portion of the wave energy reflects back towards the source. By measuring the time between transmission and the reception of this echo, one can calculate the distance to the reflecting object, with precision limited only by the accuracy of one's timing mechanism and the wavelength of the radio transmission. Aircraft, being large metal structures, make excellent reflectors of radio frequency energy. The challenge was not theoretical, but practical. Could a receiver be made sensitive enough to detect the infinitesimally small echoes returning from aircraft at operationally useful ranges? Watson Watt's preliminary calculations suggested the answer was yes, provided one used sufficiently powerful transmitters and aerials with sufficient gain. On the 26th of February, 1935, a demonstration was arranged. A Handley Page Hayford bomber, a lumbering biplane representative of the Royal Air Force's current inventory, was flown back and forth along a predetermined course near Daventry in Northamptonshire, where the BBC maintained a powerful shortwave transmitter operating at 49 meters wavelength. Watson Watt and his assistant, Arnold Wilkins, had positioned a receiving aerial and a cathode ray oscilloscope in a van 8 miles from the transmitter. As the Hayford flew through the transmission beam, the reflected signal appeared as a distinct deflection on the oscilloscope screen, visible up to a range of 8 miles. The demonstration lasted less than 20 minutes. The detection range was modest, the equipment crude, but the principle was proven beyond question. Radio detection of aircraft was feasible. The Air Ministry immediately authorized funding for further development, and by September 1935, Watson Watt's team had demonstrated detection ranges of 40 miles using purpose-built equipment operating at wavelengths of 25 meters. The question then became one of implementation. Detecting a single aircraft in controlled conditions was one thing. Creating a comprehensive early warning system capable of tracking dozens of aircraft simultaneously, determining their altitude and bearing, and transmitting this information to a centralized command center in real time was quite another. The solution that emerged, designated Chain Home, represented a pragmatic compromise between performance, cost, and speed of deployment. The system would operate at wavelengths between 10 and 13.5 meters, longer than optimal for precision, but offering the advantage of working with existing transmitter and receiver technology. Transmitter power would be substantial, 20 to 25 kilowatts, requiring large aerial arrays and significant electrical infrastructure. The stations would be built along the coastline, spaced at intervals of approximately 30 miles to provide overlapping coverage and eliminate gaps in detection. Each station would consist of 4 steel towers, 2 for transmission and 2 for reception, the transmission towers rising to heights of 90 to 110 meters to maximize range against high-altitude targets. Construction began in earnest in 1936. The first operational station at Bawdsey Manor in Suffolk was followed by installations at Dover, Canewdon, Great Bromley, and Dunkirk in Kent. By September 1938, as the Munich crisis brought Britain to the brink of war, 18 Chain Home stations were operational, providing continuous coverage from Southampton to Newcastle. The system was crude by later standards. The rotating aerials and plan position indicators that would characterize radar in subsequent years did not exist. Chain-Home used fixed transmitting aerials that sent pulses in a broad beam seaward. The reflected echoes were received on separate aerials and displayed on cathode ray oscilloscopes calibrated in range. Bearing was determined by comparing the signal strength received on 4 separate aerials oriented at different angles, a technique that provided directional information accurate to within a few degrees, but required skilled interpretation. Altitude determination was even more problematic, relying on complex geometric calculations derived from the elevation angle of the returning signal and requiring operators to use paper charts and slide rules to convert raw observations into usable data. The entire process was manual, relying on human observers to detect the echoes, measure their characteristics, and telephone the information to filter rooms where plotters would update large map tables showing the current tactical situation. Despite these limitations, Chain-Home performed with remarkable effectiveness when war came in September 1939. During the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, the system detected virtually every major daylight raid the Luftwaffe launched, providing Fighter Command with the crucial early warning that allowed outnumbered British fighters to intercept raiders with consistent success. But Chain-Home had a weakness, one that became increasingly apparent as German tactics evolved. The system's operating wavelength of 10 to 13 meters, chosen for technical convenience and rapid deployment, meant that the radio pulses were relatively long compared to the physical dimensions of an aircraft. This placed fundamental limits on the precision with which the system could determine altitude. An aircraft at low level, flying below 1,000 meters, produced echoes that merged with ground reflections, becoming effectively invisible. The mathematics of wave propagation and geometry conspired against the defenders. As autumn gave way to winter in 1940 and German bombers increasingly approached at low altitude to exploit this blind spot before climbing to bombing height over their targets, the limitations became dangerous. The Luftwaffe's shift to night operations compounded the problem. Under the cover of darkness, bombers could cross the coast at wave-top height, invisible to Chain-Home, then climb to altitude once safely inland, leaving Fighter Command with insufficient warning to position night fighters for interception. The solution to this problem had actually been developed in parallel with Chain-Home, but using radically different technology. In 1938, even as Chain-Home was being deployed, Watts and Watt's team had begun experimental work on shorter wavelength radar, operating at 1.5 meters. The physics dictated that shorter wavelengths would provide better definition of low-altitude targets and greater precision in bearing and range determination. But shorter wavelengths also required completely different transmitter and receiver technology. The high-power valves that made Chain-Home possible simply could not generate useful power at meter wavelengths and below. New transmitter designs were needed based on resonant cavity magnetrons, devices that could generate hundreds of watts at decimeter wavelengths through principles that were only partially understood even by the physicists building them. By 1939, experimental stations using this shorter wavelength technology were operating at Foreness in Kent and Sopley in Hampshire. The results were immediately apparent. Where Chain-Home's altitude determination was approximate and unreliable below 3,000 meters, the new stations, designated Chain-Home Low, could track aircraft down to 60 meters above the sea with precision. The bearing accuracy was substantially improved, the display presentation clearer, the entire system more compact and easier to operate. But the coverage was limited. The shorter wavelength meant the radio pulses followed line-of-sight paths, drastically reducing range against low-altitude targets. A Chain-Home Low station with aerials at 20 meters height could detect low-flying aircraft only to ranges of about 30 miles, less than half the range of the longer wavelength system against high-altitude targets. The solution was to use both systems in conjunction: Chain-Home for long-range warning against high-altitude formations, Chain-Home Low for precise tracking of low-level intruders and accurate altitude determination of aircraft already detected by the primary system. The integration was not immediate or simple. It required additional filter rooms, modified plotting procedures, and extensive training of operators and controllers who had to mentally synthesize information from two different radar types with different characteristics and limitations. It required additional telephone lines, new display equipment, refined procedures for correlating tracks from multiple sources. The process of building out chain home low coverage proceeded throughout 1940 and into 1941, each new station adding another segment of protected coastline, another patch of sky from which low-flying intruders could not emerge undetected. By the spring of 1941, nearly 30 chain home low stations were operational, filling the gaps in coverage that had allowed German bombers to penetrate British airspace undetected during the Blitz. The impact was measurable in minutes and lives. Controllers at Fighter Command's sector stations, receiving integrated plots showing both high and low altitude tracks with unprecedented detail, could vector night fighters onto intercepts that had been impossible just months earlier. The introduction of airborne interception radar, which allowed fighters to close the final mile of an intercept in darkness, provided the tactical capability to exploit the strategic warning. The combination of ground radar, efficient control procedures, and airborne radar transformed night fighting from random patrol to directed interception. German bomber losses, which had been negligible during the early months of the Blitz, began to climb. By May 1941, the Luftwaffe was losing aircraft at rates that made sustained night offensive operations increasingly costly. The attacks diminished in frequency and intensity, not because British cities were no longer vulnerable, but because the cost of attacking them had become prohibitive. The technological race did not end. German scientists developed electronic countermeasures, attempting to jam British radar with noise transmitters or overwhelm it with clouds of metallic foil strips that created false echoes. British engineers responded with modifications to receiver circuits, changes in operating frequencies, improved signal processing techniques. The cycle of measure and countermeasure accelerated throughout the war, each side developing new techniques, adapting to new threats, exploiting newly discovered vulnerabilities. But the fundamental advantage established by chain home and chain home low remained. Britain possessed a comprehensive early warning system that detected approaching aircraft at ranges and altitudes sufficient to allow organized defense. Germany never developed equivalent coverage of its own territory, relying instead on sound detectors, visual observers, and searchlight belts that provided minutes of warning when tens of minutes were required. The asymmetry in capability shaped the strategic air war profoundly, allowing Britain to survive the Luftwaffe's assault while progressively building the bomber force that would devastate German cities in the war's later years. The numbers tell part of the story. During the Battle of Britain, from July to October 1940, Fighter Command flew approximately 46,000 sorties, destroyed approximately 1,800 German aircraft, and lost 915 fighters in combat. Without radar early warning, these figures would have been reversed or worse. With warning times measured in minutes or seconds, British fighters would have been caught on the ground, scrambled too late, forced to climb whilst under attack, their advantage in numbers and position dissipated by lack of information. The radar network did not win the Battle of Britain alone, but it made victory possible by solving the fundamental problem of air defense, finding the enemy in the vast three-dimensional space of the sky. The 10-minute advantage was not merely temporal but strategic, transforming defensive operations from desperate improvisation to coordinated system. In the decades after the war, as radar technology evolved through generations of increasingly sophisticated systems, the principles established by chain home remained foundational. The concept of overlapping coverage by multiple stations, the integration of different radar types optimized for different targets, the centralized processing of data from distributed sensors, the real-time dissemination of tracks to multiple users simultaneously. These concepts, pioneered in the desperate circumstances of 1939 and 1940, became the standard architecture of air defense systems worldwide. Modern radar networks, with their phased array aerials, digital signal processing, and automated tracking algorithms, operate on principles that Watson Watt and his colleagues would recognize instantly. The technology has evolved beyond recognition, but the operational logic remains fundamentally unchanged. A few chain-home towers remain standing today, preserved as scheduled monuments. The towers at Stoke Holy Cross in Norfolk still rise above the surrounding countryside, their steel lattices weathered but intact, silent sentinels of a desperate time. The receiving block at Bawdsey has been converted to a museum where visitors can see the original cathode ray oscilloscopes, study the aerial arrays, imagine the young operators staring at flickering screens whilst German bombers droned overhead in the darkness. These physical remnants connect us to a moment when technological innovation intersected with strategic necessity to produce a system that changed the nature of warfare. The radar network built along Britain's coasts between 1936 and 1941 was not elegant. It was not sophisticated by modern standards. The equipment was bulky, the procedures manual, the presentation crude. But it worked. It detected aircraft at sufficient range to allow effective defense. It provided accurate enough information to guide interceptors to their targets. And crucially, it gave defenders time, that most precious of tactical commodities, the seconds and minutes needed to respond, to organize, to position forces advantageously rather than reactively. The story of chain home and chain home low is ultimately a story about margin, about the narrow space between success and failure in warfare. 10 minutes of warning seems modest, almost trivial, until one considers what happens without it. The Luftwaffe's failure to develop equivalent radar coverage for German cities meant that British and American bombers attacking by night faced defenses that were fundamentally reactive. Scrambling after the attackers had already penetrated deep into German airspace, climbing to intercept formations that were already over their targets. The defenders fought bravely and skillfully, but they fought from a position of informational disadvantage that negated much of their effort. Britain's radar network inverted this relationship, giving defenders the initiative, allowing them to position forces advantageously, to achieve surprise against the attackers rather than being surprised. The advantage was not overwhelming, not decisive in any single engagement, but cumulative over months and years of operations. It was the advantage of knowing where to look, where to position forces, when to scramble, when to wait. It was, quite simply, the advantage of time. And time, as every military commander throughout history has understood, can be converted into nearly every other form of advantage. Better position, superior concentration of force, tactical surprise, reduced fuel consumption, preserved pilot energy. The radar stations built on Britain's coasts in the late 1930s provided exactly this commodity, purchasing seconds and minutes with steel towers, transmitter valves, and cathode ray oscilloscopes, transforming invisible radio echoes into the most valuable currency of air warfare. It was an engineering solution to a strategic problem, pragmatic rather than elegant, effective rather than perfect. And in the desperate summer of 1940, when the survival of Britain as an independent nation hung in balance, that was precisely, exactly, and entirely sufficient.